The air was thick with tension as the committee of 12 gathered in the cramped, dimly lit chamber of Parliament. Paintings of past monarchs lined the walls, their stern faces watching over the proceedings as if to scrutinize every word. Among the 12 men, some were known for their sharp tongues and others for their fierce loyalty. But today they shared a singular purpose: to uncover the truth behind the mysterious death of King James. At the heart of the investigation was a claim so audacious, it had sent shockwaves through the court. Dr. John Eglisham, a man who had once been close to the royal family, had accused the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, of poisoning the king. Eglisham had implored Parliament to investigate, arguing that only the entire body of Parliament had the authority to bring the Duke to justice. The committee was determined to act on his plea, and the room buzzed with a mix of anticipation and dread. As the doors creaked open, the first witness was called. Dr. Lowther, a medical man with a reputation for discretion, entered the room. He took his seat, his eyes darting nervously around the room as he fidgeted with his notes. The committee chair, John Glanville, a lawyer known for his sharp intellect, began the questioning with a stern voice. "Dr. Lowther, can you tell us about the final days of King James's illness?" Glanville asked, his eyes fixed on the witness. Lowther cleared his throat, his voice trembling. "Certainly, sir. The king was gravely ill, and we were doing everything we could to help him. But then, on the evening of the 26th of March, the Duke of Buckingham intervened." The room grew silent as Lowther continued. "The Duke brought a plaster and a potion, claiming they would help the king recover. He insisted that the king take them, and we, being in a state of desperation, allowed it. But shortly after, the king's condition worsened dramatically." Glanville leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Can you describe the effects of the plaster and potion on the king?" Lowther nodded, his voice growing more confident. "The king became feverish and agitated. His breathing grew shallow, and he began to sweat profusely. It was clear that something was wrong. We tried to remove the plaster, but the damage had already been done." As Lowther's testimony unfolded, the committee members exchanged worried glances. The accounts of the other doctors who followed Lowther were equally damning. Dr. Archibald Hay, the king's surgeon, confirmed that the plaster had been applied and that the king's condition had deteriorated soon after. He added that the ingredients of the medicine were unknown, and that none of the doctors had been informed in advance. The committee then turned to Dr. William Harvey, a man of great renown in the medical community. Harvey, known for his groundbreaking discovery of the circulation of blood, was a close confidant of both the late king and the new king, Charles. His testimony was crucial. "Dr. Harvey, what is your opinion on the Duke's intervention?" Glanville asked, his tone respectful but probing. Harvey, a cold and calculating man, responded with a calm demeanor. "I was present when the plaster and potion were administered. While I did not know the ingredients, I trusted the Duke's judgment. The king himself requested the treatment, and I saw no reason to object. However, I must admit that the king's condition did worsen after the intervention." The committee's next witness, Dr. John Craig, a Scottish doctor who had been excluded from the king's sick room for his outspoken objections, provided a shocking revelation. He admitted that he and another doctor had approached the new king, Charles, to intervene and stop the Duke's interference. But Charles had remained silent, seemingly indifferent to the pleas of the doctors. This new information sent a ripple through the room. The committee members, many of whom had close ties to Charles, were stunned. Questions began to swirl in their minds. Why had Charles not acted to protect his father? What had he known about the Duke's actions? The implications were too dangerous to ignore. The investigation continued, with each witness adding more pieces to the puzzle. Dr. Gilbert Primrose, another surgeon, recounted how the king had produced a large amount of black, noxious matter shortly before his death, a sign that something toxic had been introduced into his body. The committee also heard from Robert Ramsay, a mysterious figure who claimed to have overheard a conversation between an Irishman named Piers Butler and the Duke. Butler, according to Ramsay, had been involved in the creation of a potion containing the spirit of toads, a substance associated with witchcraft. The committee's final witness, John Moore, a doctor who had been present during the king's final days, confirmed that a list of the potion's ingredients had been presented to the other doctors. However, Moore could provide no evidence to support the claim that the ingredients were harmless. As the testimony concluded, the committee chair, John Glanville, addressed the full House of Parliament. His words were measured but incendiary. The committee has found that the plaster and potion were applied at prohibited times, when the king was vulnerable. These actions were directed by the Duke of Buckingham, and they had a detrimental effect on the king's condition. The committee believes that these actions should be considered a grave presumption of dangerous consequence. The room fell silent, the weight of Glanville's words hanging in the air. The investigation had only just begun, but the evidence was mounting. The Duke of Buckingham's position was growing increasingly precarious, and the shadow of suspicion loomed over the new King, Charles. The court was on the brink of a crisis, and the truth about King James's death was about to be revealed. The tension in the House of Commons was palpable. It was April 1626, and the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, was under intense scrutiny. The MP were determined to hold him accountable for his actions, and the atmosphere was electric. On April 28, Amerigo Salvetti, a Florentine diplomat, noted in his report that the Commons was consumed by the Duke's impeachment. The excitement grew daily as new allegations emerged, and the MP met twice a day to expedite the proceedings. On May 1st, a young boy, George Digby, son of John Digby, Earl of Bristol, stood at the entrance of the Commons chamber. He held a petition on behalf of his father, who was under house arrest. The petition accused the Duke of Buckingham of tarnishing his father's honor, and demanded that John Digby be either released or put on trial. The Commons listened intently, and the young Digby's plea added another layer of complexity to the already charged environment. That same day, in the House of Lords, John Digby appeared before the bar. With the Attorney General about to read the charges against him, Digby suddenly stood up and pointed at the Duke. "I accuse that man, the Duke of Buckingham, of high treason, and I will prove it," he declared. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to the Duke, who remained calm, assuring Digby that he would not interrupt him because they had once been friends. The allegations against the Duke were explosive. Digby accused him of luring King Charles to the House of the Seven Chimneys, where he had attempted to convert Charles to Catholicism. He alleged that the Duke had used his influence to gain favors from the Spanish king, Philip, and that his behavior had ultimately led to the collapse of the Spanish marriage negotiations. The final blow came when Digby suggested that the Duke had a role in King James's death, just days before he was to be summoned to London to testify against the Duke. The Duke was furious. He stood up and threatened Digby, warning him to prove his accusations or face the consequences. The Lords, realizing the gravity of the situation, decided to hear the king's charges against Digby first. However, Digby protested, arguing that this would prevent his case from being heard. The Duke then proposed a compromise, suggesting that both cases be heard simultaneously, which calmed the tense atmosphere. Despite the Duke's confidence, the tide was turning against him. The following day, the Committee of 12 presented a new charge to the Commons. This charge, carefully worded, hinted at the Duke's involvement in King James's treatment. It alleged that the Duke had procured plasters and a potion for the king without the knowledge of the royal physicians, raising suspicions of foul play. The King, Charles, tried to protect the Duke by sending a letter to the Lords. He praised the Duke's loyalty and dismissed Digby's accusations. Charles urged the Lords to prioritize his charges against Digby and not to treat the Duke's case equally. However, the Commons, undeterred, passed a motion to send a delegation to the Lords to present the 13 charges against the Duke and demand his impeachment. On May 6th, the delegation from the Commons, led by Dudley Digges, Christopher Wansford, and John Eliot, met with the Lords in the Painted Chamber. Digges began with a powerful analogy, comparing the Duke to a blazing star that disrupted the cosmic order. He laid out the charges, culminating in Wansford's nervous but determined presentation of the 13th charge, which accused the Duke of administering harmful medicines to King James. Eliot concluded the proceedings with a scathing comparison of the Duke to Sejanus, a corrupt favorite of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. The Lords, including the Duke, were visibly uncomfortable. In response, the king ordered Digges and Eliot to be imprisoned in the Tower, citing their scandalous words about King James's death. The Commons erupted in anger, vowing to halt all proceedings until their colleagues were released. The next day, the Commons gathered in silence, refusing to allow the Speaker to read the order of the day. John Wilda, an MP, delivered a somber speech, lamenting the loss of two valued colleagues and warning of the threat to their freedoms. The king's vice-chamberlain, Dudley Carleton, tried to justify the arrests, but his speech was met with hostility. He revealed that the king was upset by the implications that he might have been involved in his father's death, and that the MPS' refusal to recant had sealed their fate. Meanwhile, the royal palace at Whitehall was in a state of crisis. The treasury was empty, creditors were demanding payment, and unpaid soldiers and sailors were flooding into London, causing unrest. The king, feeling the weight of the situation, asked the Duke, "What more can I do? I have lost the love of my subjects. What would you have me do?" The Duke, undeterred, urged the king to defy the Commons and offer him more power. Despite lacking a university education, the Duke was nominated as the Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, a move that sparked further outrage. The university dons resisted, but the king's influence prevailed and the Duke was appointed, much to the dismay of many. The stage was set for a showdown between the king and Parliament, and the fate of the Duke of Buckingham hung in the balance. The storm raged outside the Palace of Westminster, its fury reflecting the turbulent mood inside. George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, stood before the House of Lords, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. He humbly acknowledged that his rise to power might have been undeserved, but he hoped to regain the respect of his critics. He then addressed each of the charges against him with careful precision, explaining his actions and challenging his accusers. Throughout his speech, he reminded the Lords that everything he had done was with the king's approval and knowledge. George concluded his defense with a legal point that left his enemies stunned. He reminded the Lords that he had received a general pardon from King James, which Charles had reconfirmed at his coronation. He even produced a copy of the document, showing the Great Seal. This pardon, he argued, made him immune to prosecution, even if he was guilty of the crimes he was accused of. A few days later, on June 12th, the House of Commons received George's replies. They were referred to a subcommittee, and the Commons continued to discuss a remonstrance against the arrest of Eliot and Digges. King Charles, growing impatient, sent a letter threatening to dissolve Parliament if a subsidy bill was not passed within the week. As the Commons debated, a violent storm hit the Palace of Westminster. The wind rattled the windows, and rain and hail pounded the roof. The Thames swelled, and a mist rose from the river, swirling toward York House, George's residence. The storm seemed to have a life of its own, as if nature itself was reacting to the political turmoil. 2 days later, a delegation from the Commons presented their remonstrance to the king. Charles promised to respond the next day, but instead, he summoned the MP to the House of Lords and announced the immediate dissolution of Parliament. An MP who had been keeping a diary noted the event with a Latin phrase, "Sic abint omnes et ses, at gloria regni," so they may go away, and all the glory of the kingdom ceases. The tension in London was palpable, and the city's theaters were not immune. One such place was the Fortune Playhouse, located just outside the city walls. Rebuilt after a fire in 1621, it had once been a refined venue, but by 1628 it was in decline, attracting a rowdy crowd of apprentices and street vendors. On July 13, 1628, Dr. John Lamb, an 80-year-old mystic and sexual predator, joined the crowd to see a play. Lamb was a notorious figure, known for his association with George Villiers. He had been accused of dark magic and sexual crimes, but had been pardoned by the king. His name was linked to George in various songs and stories, including a lost book titled The Devil and the Duke. As Lamb took his seat in the gallery, many in the audience recognized him and his connection to the Duke. The play did little to lift the surly mood, and as the audience left, a group of young men and women began to follow Lamb. Fearing for his safety, Lamb took refuge in a tavern near the city walls, hoping the mob would disperse. When he emerged, he found the crowd still waiting. He hired some sailors for protection and tried to make his way through the streets, but the mob only grew more threatening. Eventually, Lamb took shelter in the Windmill Tavern, but the building came under attack. The landlord forced him out, and the mob fell upon him with stones and cudgels. The constables were alerted, but they either did not intervene or arrived too late. Lamb was found unconscious on the street, his skull broken and one eye hanging out of his head. He was taken to the Poultry Compter, a prison where he died the next morning. The king was outraged by Lamb's death, and demanded that the Lord Mayor of London find those responsible. When no culprits were found, several constables were arrested and jailed for neglect of duty. Handwritten notes began to appear around Coleman Street, predicting that George would meet the same fate as Lamb. In the same part of London, John Felton, a soldier with unpaid wages and a wounded hand, was nursing his grievances. He had participated in the disastrous expeditions to Cadiz and La Rochelle, and blamed George for his misfortunes. Felton sought the help of a scrivener, George Willoughby, to write petitions about his grievances. Willoughby, a scribe in high demand due to the political turmoil, was transcribing the latest remonstrance from the House of Commons. Felton borrowed a copy of the remonstrance and read it in a tavern. The document's harsh criticism of George convinced Felton that the Duke was not only responsible for his personal problems, but was a dangerous figure threatening the kingdom. Felton underwent a period of fasting and prayer, and on August 18th, he decided it was time to act. The next morning, Felton visited his mother and sister to borrow some money, telling them he was going to Portsmouth to confront George about his unpaid wages. He then bought a dagger from a cutler near Tower Hill and set off for Southwick House, where George was staying. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation that would change the course of history. The news of George's death spread like wildfire across the kingdom. People in Portsmouth were stunned, and the inn where it all happened was in chaos. Kate, George's wife, was devastated. She rushed down to see her husband lying on the table, blood pooling around him. His last moments were a mix of fear and bravery as he tried to stand up to his attacker, but it was too late. The man who killed George, John Felton, was caught soon after. He didn't try to hide, even stepping forward to claim responsibility. Some people thought he was a hero, while others saw him as a traitor. Felton was tortured, tried, and executed, but his name lived on as a symbol of rebellion. Charles the King was heartbroken. He locked himself away for days, refusing to see anyone. The country was divided. While many mourned George's death, others celebrated. The king's loyalty to George was clear, but it also showed how much he had relied on his friend. Without George, Charles retreated from public life, focusing on his art collection and governing through small committees. George's mother, Mary, took the news calmly, though she had always feared something like this would happen. His body was brought back to London with a somber procession. He lay in state for nearly a month, but the crowds were thin. On a dark night, he was buried at Westminster Abbey, away from the noisy and sometimes hostile public. The death of George had a profound impact on Charles's reign. The king and queen, Henrietta Maria, began to grow closer. After years of struggling to have children, they welcomed a son, Charles, and then more children followed. The family's newfound happiness was captured in paintings, showing a more intimate and affectionate side of the royal couple. However, the peace didn't last. Tensions between the king and Parliament grew, leading to civil war. Charles was eventually captured and put on trial, though the charges focused on his actions during the war. Old accusations about George's death resurfaced. Some believed Charles had a hand in it, adding to the bitter animosity between the king and his opponents. In the years that followed, George's memory was often tarnished. He was portrayed as a corrupt favorite, exploiting the king's trust and causing harm to the kingdom. But as the anger subsided, a more balanced view emerged. James Shirley, a playwright and poet, wrote a short but powerful epitaph that captured the complexity of George's life. Here lies the best and worst of fate, two kings' delight, the people's hate, the courtier's star, the kingdom's eye, a man to draw an angel by. Fear's despiser, Villiers' glory, the great man's volume, all time's story. George's life and death were a testament to the tumultuous times he lived in. He was a man of great ambition and influence, but also a figure of controversy and division. His story remains a part of history, a reminder of the highs and lows of power and loyalty.